Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Today, I am telling you the story of the novel Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen in detail. Here is a summary of the plot. The novel begins with the death of Mr. Henry Dashwood, who leaves his estate to his son John from his first marriage, according to the law of entailment. His second wife and their 3 daughters, Elinor, Marianne, and Margaret, are left with little income and no permanent home. John's wife, Fanny, persuades him to give them only a small allowance, and they move into Norland Park, the Dashwood estate. At Norland, Elinor forms an attachment with Fanny's brother, Edward Ferrars, who is shy, sensible, and kind. However, Fanny disapproves of their relationship and hints that Edward is engaged to a woman of whom his family would not approve. Mrs. Dashwood decides to move her family to Barton Cottage in Devonshire, where they are offered a modest residence by her cousin, Sir John Middleton. In Devonshire, the Dashwoods are introduced to Sir John's wife, Lady Middleton, their mother, Mrs. Jennings, and their friends, Colonel Brandon and Mr. Willoughby. Colonel Brandon is a wealthy, reserved, and honorable gentleman who falls in love with Marianne at first sight. Marianne, however, is attracted to the handsome, charming, and impetuous Willoughby, who rescues her from a fall and shares her taste in poetry and music. Willoughby and Marianne soon become inseparable, and everyone assumes that they are engaged, except for Elinor, who notices that Willoughby has not proposed or asked for Mrs. Dashwood's consent. Willoughby suddenly announces that he has to leave for London on urgent business, leaving Marianne heartbroken and desperate. She writes to him several times, but receives no reply. Meanwhile, Mrs. Jennings invites Elinor and Marianne to accompany her to London, hoping to find suitable matches for them. Elinor agrees, hoping to see Edward and find out the truth about his engagement. In London, Elinor and Marianne are snubbed by Willoughby, who barely acknowledges Marianne's presence at a ball and later sends her a cold letter, enclosing her letters and a lock of his hair, and informing her that he is engaged to a rich heiress, Miss Sophia Grey. Marianne is devastated, and Elinor is angry and disappointed with Willoughby's behavior. Colonel Brandon visits Elinor and reveals to her the reason for his hatred of Willoughby. He seduced and abandoned Brandon's young ward, Eliza Williams, who is also the illegitimate daughter of Brandon's first love. Brandon also tells Elinor that he has a living brother and a child, whom he has never seen. Elinor also learns from Lucy Steele, a distant relation of Mrs. Jennings, that she has been secretly engaged to Edward for 4 years. Lucy confides in Elinor, hoping to gain her favor and support, but Elinor is shocked and hurt by the news, and wonders how Edward could be so dishonorable and deceitful. She conceals her feelings from everyone, even from Marianne, and behaves politely and kindly to Lucy, despite her jealousy and resentment. Elinor and Marianne receive a visit from their brother John, who tells them that Fanny's sister, Anne, is going to marry a wealthy and well-connected gentleman. He also hints that Edward is soon to be married to a Miss Morton, a daughter of a lord, and that his mother, Mrs. Ferrars, is very pleased with the match. Elinor is confused and doubtful, but does not contradict him. Elinor and Marianne are invited to stay with Mrs. Jennings' daughter, Mrs. Palmer, and her husband, at their house in Cleveland, on their way back to Barton. There, they meet Mr. Palmer's mother, who turns out to be the mother of Willoughby's fiancée, Miss Grey. She tells Elinor that Willoughby is unhappy with his marriage, and that he still loves Marianne. She also reveals that Willoughby had written to Mrs. Dashwood, asking for her forgiveness and explaining his situation. He had fallen in love with Marianne, but had no fortune of his own, and was dependent on his aunt, Mrs. Smith, who had threatened to disinherit him if he married Marianne. He had hoped to inherit a large sum from a relation, but the relation died and left the money to Miss Grey instead. Willoughby then decided to marry Miss Grey for her money, but soon regretted his choice. He had also tried to see Marianne in London, but was prevented by his wife. Marianne falls ill with a fever, and her condition worsens. Elinor fears for her life, and sends for their mother. Colonel Brandon also offers to bring Mrs. Dashwood, showing his concern and generosity. Marianne recovers, and is grateful to Colonel Brandon for his kindness. She also reads Willoughby's letter, and realizes that he was not the ideal man she had imagined, and that she had been too imprudent and romantic in her conduct. Elinor and Marianne return to Barton with their mother, and are soon joined by Edward, who comes to visit them. Elinor prepares to congratulate him on his marriage, but is surprised to learn that he is not married, and that Lucy has eloped with his brother, Robert. Edward explains that he had been engaged to Lucy when he was young and foolish, but had soon regretted it, and had fallen in love with Elinor. However, he had felt bound by his promise to Lucy, and had not dared to break it. When Lucy's engagement to Edward was discovered by his mother, she disinherited him and gave his fortune to Robert. Lucy then transferred her affections to Robert, and married him secretly. Edward was then free to marry Elinor, and he proposed to her, with the consent of Mrs. Dashwood. Elinor accepted him joyfully, and they were married soon after. Marianne also found happiness with Colonel Brandon, who had loved her faithfully and patiently. She learned to appreciate his virtues and his constancy, and to moderate her sensibility with sense. They were married, and settled at Delaford, near Barton. Elinor and Edward also lived nearby, at the parsonage of Edward's small living, which was given to him by Colonel Brandon. The two couples remained close and happy, and visited each other often. They also maintained a cordial relationship with the Ferrars family, who eventually reconciled with Edward and Elinor. Willoughby, however, remained unhappy and dissatisfied with his wife and his life, and often regretted losing Marianne. This is the end of the story of Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. I hope you enjoyed it.